Hi, I'm David Berlind, Editor-in-Chief of ProgrammableWeb, and this is another Developers Rock podcast. With me today is Ben Dowling. He's the CEO and founder of IPInfo. This is a special sponsored podcast. Ben, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks, David.
So it's great to have you here on the ProgrammableWeb podcast, and we've exchanged a few notes and been speaking to each other in preparation for this particular podcast. The first question I want to ask you is a little bit about the history of IPInfo. How did it get started? What were you trying to accomplish when you first got going?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, I started it, it was 6 years ago, and I'd just been kind of Googling, trying to find some data on my IP address. I was just curious and was like struggling to find a website and much less an API. And I thought, well, this could be, just like a fun little project to build, just to satisfy myself, and kind of knock something together pretty quickly. Launched it and posted it to Stack Overflow and a few other places, and the site started getting some traction. And more people were using it, and that's when I was like, well, I should keep building this out and add some more fields, make it more useful. So it kind of like happened very organically. It started with something that I had kind of no expectation around. That I'd seen that there was there was no like easy, simple solution to kind of pull your IP address data or even view it on a web page or get it through an API. There were data sets that were available that had the data, but it was a case of you had to download that, set it up. The data would get out of date, so you'd have to update it and write scripts to update that or do it manually. And there's nothing that was just kind of like super simple, super easy to use. I think that's why a lot of people started using this, because it was just like much more easy to use than alternatives. And yeah, it kind of took off from there.
So fundamentally, how does IPInfo work? So
fundamentally, you send us an IP address and we return a bunch of information about it. So we have geolocation, so fields like the latitude and longitude, city, zip code. We have information about the ASN, so what the ISP is or what kind of connection you're on. And we have information about, in some of our other plans, our pro plans, if the IP address belongs to a company and which company, the type of provider you're on, whether it's an ISP or a hosting provider. And so there are a couple of ways that we're primarily used, and that's either you can just add a kind of a snippet of JavaScript to your website, and then someone visits your website, and then the actual browser kind of hits our API. You don't need to provide the IP address. We'll just kind of look up based on the IP address we requested from. So obviously helps websites kind of customize content and things based on where their user's visiting from or their provider. And then the other way, you can kind of pass in an actual IP address. So you could like server side say, okay, here's a user's IP address, or here's an IP address that I actually want information for, and you can pass that into us, and we'll send the details back.
So presumably, when you first basically started to scratch an itch, so to say, a bunch of other people saw what you had done. It got some traction. Was it free at the beginning for them, and is it free now?
So initially it was 100% free, and I had really no plans to kind of commercialize it. It was just like, well, this is cool. It works for me. It'd be useful for some other people. Let's kind of launch it. And then after like a few months, I sort of was getting some traction, and then I got an alert from my server provider at the time. It's like, oh yeah, your CPU's pegged at 100%. It's like, oh yeah, there's probably a bug in the code or something's gone wrong. Take a look at the server logs, and like millions and millions of requests are coming in.
Great problem to have, right?
It was. And so then at that point, it's like, well, this is interesting. There's lots of people using this much more heavily than I assumed. And so I'd love to keep, let people use it for free, hobbyists and things. But for these people that are using it at higher frequency, let's see if they're either interested in paying for it, or they can stop using me, right? And either one's kind of fine. At that point, my server bill is kind of going up. And so I kind of looked at the usage patterns and kind of said, well, let's keep it free below 1,000 requests a day. And that was kind of like what I thought like a hobbyist project might get up to. But anybody that wants to use us for more than that, then we set various tiers. I think starting at $10 a month and going up from there based on how much usage there was, and kind of launch those prices and with very little expectation of how much people might kind of go for those. And then very quickly we had paying customers that were more than happy to pay us those prices based on the volumes that they needed. And that was when it kind of became a business. And it's like, wow, okay, let's kind of take this more seriously.
Well, congratulations. I mean, a lot of companies want to be a successful API provider, are looking for ways to monetize their APIs. They don't know how to get started. And it sounds like you sort of kind of fell into it by accident almost. And that's a great way to get started. One question I have, though, is when we look at the Programmable Web API directory, we see that there are quite a few other providers of this same sort of information, IP-based geolocation. What sets you apart in your mind from all the other guys that are out there?
Yeah, absolutely. So and there are a lot of these other kind of IP geolocation APIs around, and it seems like there's a new one starting almost every week, right? I think that some of these guys have seen the success that we've had, and it's kind of simple to set something up, but what it's difficult to do is kind of like to do that at scale. So we now handle over 20 billion API requests a month. We've been around for a long time. A lot of these API providers will kind of spin up, try it for a few months, and be like, oh, it's not having the traction I want, so I'll kind of shut it down. I think we're totally committed to being around for the long term and being a provider of long term. I think in our kind of 6-year history, we haven't had any major outages. There's been a few incidents when I've deployed a bug, and there's been some issues for a while, or we were on AWS for a while, and there was like an AWS outage, so we were down for a little bit when AWS was down. But we take like our reliability very seriously, and over a 6-year history, there had been no kind of major outages. A lot of other providers, they might go down for a couple of days and then come up, or their latency can be all over the place. Whereas so I think our API is reliable. I think we're a trustworthy company to work with. We take the latency of our API very seriously. And also we now at this point, we've been around for a long time. We've got all the customers, and we've got a team of engineers that are working on this, right? So we're constantly improving our product, improving our data, and so I think if you want a kind of a reliable, trustworthy solution that is going to kind of be around for a long term, then we're the right team to go with.
Yeah, it seems a little bit like you had some first mover advantage though too, because when you've got that many API calls happening on a daily, weekly, or monthly basis, and you've got a business model attached to it, and you're generating revenue, and another competitor comes along and tries to take a slice of your pie, they need to scale to some number of API calls before they're going to generate enough revenue to compete with you, right? So
Sure.
A little bit of, seems like a little bit of a first mover advantage. You mentioned AWS. Sure. You mentioned AWS. Are you still on AWS?
No, so the history of our infrastructure actually. So the very first version was just on a Linode VPS. I think it was like a $20 a month server. Then the first diversification of that was we were like, well, we need this to be a reliable service. We've got customers that at that time they weren't paying customers. It's just like there's a bunch of people using us. If the server goes down or there's a Linode outage, that's be a problem. So the first version of like redundancy that we set up was to like have a Linode VPS and a DigitalOcean VPS and just have like round robin DNS. And that worked okay for a while, but it was kind of a pain to manage. And then we switched to AWS, and that AWS served us really well for a while. We were able to handle a lot of traffic on AWS. But about a year ago, maybe 2 years ago, we switched over to Google Cloud, and we moved everything over to Google Cloud. And that was a great move for us. And we use a lot of it. So obviously we have our API. We do a lot of data processing to create all the data that goes into our API. And so we've made a lot of use of a lot of the Google, Google Composer, Google BigQuery, and do a lot of great stuff with the Google Cloud tools there.
I see. So you've had a lot of success doing IP geolocation over the last 6 years. Got a business model up and running, an extraordinary number of API calls a day. Have you diversified into other areas? Are you looking to diversify?
Yeah, absolutely. So our geolocation API, or our IP details API that has the geolocation and the ISP data and things like that, that's still the bulk of our business and the bulk of our API requests. But over time, we build out more and more products and we'll continue to do that. So some of those we've built out additional ASN details. So we have an ASN classification product. So one thing.
I'm sorry, ASN, what does that stand for?
Yeah, so an ASN is basically, so the way that IPs are structured is each IP range has an ASN that's responsible for it. So that will usually be an ISP, or it could be, it could be a business or something. And so
I see. Okay.
So given an IP address, you can map that to an ASN, which is kind of an organization that's responsible for that IP address. And so what we've done is we've gone through and we've created collected a lot of data on ASNs, which feeds into our products. We've also created, so we've done some machine learning around our ASN data and classified each ASN. So we classified it as to one of four types. So it's either an ISP, a hosting provider, a business, or an educational institution.
Yep.
And that's been really useful for some of our customers and for a bunch of different things. So one use, we had a customer that is using this to basically to block what they suspect is like suspicious activity on the website. So if they expect basically most things to be done on their site from consumers or businesses. Whereas if they say, okay, like we're seeing some activity from this IP address that's been classified as a hosting provider, the chances are it's a script or there's some automation or it's been used as a proxy. And so they can either block that or they can kind of queue that for review. And so that's been an interesting thing. That's been a lot of fun to work on as well, actually. We've got other APIs. So one thing we do is we have all the domains that host an IP address. So you could say, okay, given this IP address, what domains are hosted on it or how many domains. We classify them as well. We can say, well, here's the top million ranked domains are on, how many of those are on this IP range or IP address. And what we're doing is looking at more and more domain data as well. So we've obviously, to create that product, we had to go and find out where all the domains and what all the domains hosted on. So one thing we started looking at is, okay, where else can we kind of put in domain data and where can we use that? Another thing is IP ranges for a business. So we've got a few customers that have started using this recently, where it's like, okay, say, what domains are Facebook responsible for? So you can pass in facebook.com to our IP ranges API, and we'll return a list of all the different IP ranges that Facebook either own or operate or responsible for. And that's been useful for a vast range of things, from ad targeting to cybersecurity stuff, where you might want to give access to ranges or block access to ranges. So we're working hard on basically like putting in lots of different data and then working out ways that we can make that data accessible to different businesses and for different use cases.
And I'm assuming that these different models or these different classes of data that you offer may trigger an additional fee from a business model perspective. Is that how it works?
Yes, that's usually how it works. So most of these have come from, they normally start as like a custom request. So, we start with our main API, we get customers on that, and then they come to us and say, hey, your API has been really useful helping us do, whatever X is. But if you could come up with this data, that would be even more helpful for what we're trying to do.
So you're very customer driven. When customers give you feedback, you take that back into your lab and say, okay, yeah, we could probably do that, and then it becomes a part of the product.
Exactly. So kind of our core competency is being able to kind of deal with these APIs at scale. And the other core competency is like we've got really good at data processing and data pipelines and things like that. So when a customer comes to us and is like, hey, could you kind of come up with this IP related data set? It's like, well, yeah, sure, we'll take a look at that and see what we can figure out. And then that kind of works its way through like a product pipeline, and it might start as like something we do just for that customer, but over time ends up being like, okay, great, this works its way into like the API that everybody then has access to.
One last question: has anybody come along to you and said, hey, boy, that data that you're collecting on an IP address is an area of sensitivity these days? Everybody's under the gun for ensuring the privacy of users, protecting sensitive information. Is that an issue for you?
That hasn't been an issue for us specifically. Like nobody's come to us and said that. I mean, I definitely, think that it's an environment right now where people are more concerned about privacy. I think what sometimes gets kind of, I've seen there's been a lot of confusion around like IP address geolocation. I've seen that there's some posts where like the police have been raiding someone's house in the middle of nowhere. I think that so with IP geolocation, at least with our accuracy, with most solutions, it's city level accuracy, right? So we're not saying, okay, there's someone at this exact location, there's someone at this exact place.
Yeah.
It's like, hey, there's someone in Seattle or there's someone in San Francisco.
I see. General vicinity.
Exactly. And so like, it's not a good solution for like, say, creating an Uber, right? Like no one's gonna be able to come and pick you up in Seattle. But it's great for like lots of applications, like say, where is your nearest airport, right? There's normally only like one airport near, or, a handful of airports. Mm-hmm. And so that in that case, it's like, there is definitely, it gives you more information than you other might have. I might not know that that someone might not know I was in Seattle if they didn't have IP geolocation. But knowing I'm in Seattle is, it's not much as a privacy concern. It's like, okay, we know that Ben's here right now, right?
So where can developers find you if after hearing this podcast they're like, boy, that's what I need in my application? How do they find your website and your developer portal?
Sure. So our website's IPInfo.io. We've got a ton of developer documentation available at IPInfo.io/developers. We're on GitHub as IPInfo, Twitter as IPInfo.io. We've got a bunch of SDKs. So we've got, for all the major programming languages, PHP, Python, Go, Java, Ruby, and we've also recently
a lot of the server side platforms there, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've just launched as well a couple of server side as well, but sort of like middleware for Django and Rails that kind of does a lot of the heavy lifting for you. For the longest time, we wanted to make the API as simple as possible. So we kind of resisted writing SDKs. We're like, well, actually, we've made it so easy that you don't need one. So we get more and more requests for like the same things over and over. Right? It's like, oh, hey, you returned the country code. Well, I want the full country name. We'd say, oh, it's just these few lines of code. And then we're like, actually, instead of telling 10 people to write these 2 lines of code, we'll just do it for them. So we've kind of built in a bunch of like common use cases into SDKs like caching, filtering bot user agents and things like that.
Sure. Developers love that stuff because it makes it so much easier for them to just get an application up and running. Eventually they may scale back and go through the raw API, but SDKs really makes the onboarding process go a lot more smoothly for some developers.
For sure.
Yeah. Well, Ben Dowling, CEO and founder of IPInfo, thanks very much for joining us today on Programmable Web's Developers Rock podcast.
Yeah, thank you, David.
Okay, everybody. Well, thanks very much for joining us. You can find our coverage of this and other APIs on ProgrammableWeb.com. You can see this video either on ProgrammableWeb.com or up on our YouTube channel, where other videos can be found, www.youtube.com/ProgrammableWeb. For Programmable Web, I'm David Berlin. Thanks for joining us.